Hello, everybody, and welcome into the Apples and Ginos Fantasy Hockey Podcast. My name is Nate Grutniblink, and I'm the creator of Apples and Ginos, originator of the Zero G Draft strategy. And in this podcast, I have a special guest here to break down the aftermath of the NHL Draft. Let's get it. All right. Well, my guest today is none other than Victor Nuño, and he's got quite the list of things that he's got his fingers into. Co-host of the Fantasy Hockey Life podcast, the Dauber Prospect Report podcast, contributor to EP Ringside, editor at Dauber Prospects. Despite all that, he still made time to join the podcast here tonight, and for that, I do thank you, Victor. How are you doing? And how was the draft?
I'm doing great, Nate. Thanks for having me on. I was actually just listening to you earlier today when you and Blake and Josh breaking down the free agency stuff. That was fun. And man,
Yeah,
the draft was awesome. It was
I can
really awesome.
imagine.
Yeah, I hope it looked as cool on TV because there were times you're just looking up at the effects and the sphere and all the amazing visuals that they were able to present. And you're just thinking like, wow. There were a couple of times where I almost got a little seasick almost. It was like, whoa, it was a little overwhelming, but it was very, very cool.
Yeah, I remember as a kid, like going to IMAX theaters and stuff like that, and like feeling a little bit like I was moving in my seat. So I can only imagine it's a similar experience, probably cranked up to 11 being in there.
Yeah,
All
it
right.
was rad.
Well, let's not waste any time. Let's get into it. We've got a lot of topics to cover here today, and I'm excited to talk about this with you. I said this before, but what I really appreciate about what you bring to it, Victor, is there's definitely lots of like scouts out there on Twitter that are posting a lot, and they provide a lot of valuable analysis for sure. But you also bring the fantasy side because you play a lot of fantasy and you play a lot of dynasty fantasy in particular. And so I really appreciate that you can kind of get into the scouting side, but also kind of direct that into fantasy specifically for us. So let's start with this one. Just overall strength of the class. You know, how many surefire top line players do you think there are? Stuff like that. How do you feel this class compares in general?
Well, overall, this is the defenseman class. I think that's been pretty clear for a while. There's been a couple others that have been similar. I think 2018 people point to 2022 was pretty good, but I think this will go down as one of the best defensive class in a long time, if not history. You're getting quality guys that could conceivably be top four in the second round. That's the type that you're looking at, probably 8 or so that could legitimately be top line guys. And so you just don't see that kind of depth. Obviously there's some pretty great forwards at the very top too, different types, whether it's all around guys like Macklin or the high point, wingers like Demidov and the big giant all around centers like Lindstrom. And there's different types of forwards too, so I think that's kind of interesting too, but a couple of them with like the elite talent. I don't know that there's a certainly not a McDavid and
Sure.
possibly not even a Bedard in terms of the upside, but some pretty nice value guys. And I think even in the second, third round there's some pretty interesting guys. I think the forwards kind of thin out a bit more towards the second, third round, but there's always some value guys. So in terms of like surefire guys, I would say top line for sure. In my mind, there's 4. There's Celebrini and
Okay.
Demidov,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's Dickinson and Bouillon. I think those are the guys that I feel pretty comfortable. I know that other people may say some other guys, but I just think there's more questions with some of the other guys, the way they play and how well that's all going to translate to the NHL. But those are my 4. If I had to pick 4, that would be them.
All right. Yeah, that it kind of leads me into my next question. So if we look at the top end of the drafts, and we are obviously looking at this through a fantasy lens, but if we're tiering up the top end of the draft, how do you feel that those tiers kind of go? Like I've heard a lot of fantasy people saying like Celebrini and Demidov might be tiered together, and then it's a drop off before we get to the next group of guys for fantasy purposes. Do you feel similarly to that? Would you tier it a little bit differently just among these top end guys?
Yeah, I would. So I would tier it like this. I would say that there are 5 tiers. The top line, pretty for sure guys that you want to get your hands on. Then there's tier 2, guys that have some questions, but you're pretty happy to walk away with the draft from them. Then I think there's a tier that is just better in real life than fantasy that I would
Hmm.
take if I had to, but I'm not going to reach for them. Then there's the volatile guys that have upside, and then there's we probably don't even need tier 5, but there's a couple guys that are
Yeah.
just like not much fantasy value. So tier 1, I mean, clearly Celebrini, Demidov are tier 1, but I would also put Perek in tier 1 and
Okay.
Berkeley Catton, because I
Okay.
think if you're looking at who has point per game upside, I think it's those 4: Celebrini, Demidov, Perek, and Catton, and notably one of those guys is the defenseman. So
Mhm.
that's obviously pretty exciting, and I think he's clearly the top offensive defenseman in this class. And people have been talking all year about how he has questions defensively, but I think he has far fewer questions than, we'll talk about Carter Yakimchuk later. I think he has far fewer questions than Carter Yakimchuk, certainly than Cole
Mhm.
Hudson.
Mhm.
Even someone like Adam Yurchuk. I think Zane Perek is quite good defensively. Maybe not super physical and maybe not the most amazing skater, but like he's just so smart and he figures out how to make it work. And he's really good with his stick. So I don't think that's going to be an issue for him. And his offense is just so elite that that's a tier in and of its own for me. Those 4.
All right. And then, so you get beyond those guys, and who do you have in the next year? Does it start to widen out after that, or is it a relatively contained group there?
No, there's a lot of names in tier 2.
Sure.
So I would add, let's see, how many do I have here? Like 10. So a
Okay.
lot of names: Seneca, Lindstrom, McGinley, Connolly, Iserman, Buyam, Levshunov, Yakimchuk, Greentree, Hemming, Chernyshov, Artemonov, and Teddy Stiga. Now, a
Okay.
couple of those guys, the last 3 were second rounders. Well,
Hmm.
Chernyshov was 33, and Hemming was at the end of the first. But I think all these guys have pretty significant point upside. They all have some question more, one thing or another about them. I think the first
Right.
few being top 10 picks are going to be, the first 3. So Seneca, Lindstrom, and Iginla being top 10 picks, obviously there's going to be a lot more leeway for those players and a lot more resources dedicated to them and an investment in the team to make them successful. So they would be at the top of that tier just because of that. But I think some of the other guys, certainly like Iserman and Connolly, even Greentree, have pretty significant points upside. So it's kind of interesting how some of these guys went quite a bit later. Even Chernyshov, I mean,
Yeah.
everyone was freaking out when he didn't get picked in round 1. It's like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. I wanna focus in on the defenseman for a minute. Because I do think, like you mentioned, that it is one of the biggest features of this class, specifically on the top end guys, the guys who went high in the draft, and maybe others that you think are they're equal, maybe went a little bit later. It sounds like you're pretty high on Perek. I think that's probably going to be a pretty common opinion for fantasy folks. I've definitely seen his model comparisons and people getting pretty excited about his goal scoring ability in particular, which is always so rare to find from the blue line. But after Perek, how would you rank just the top next group of guys? I guess you would say, like, obviously you have Lev Shunov going at the number 2 overall to Chicago, but does he really have the offensive upside of maybe some of the other guys that we obviously are most interested in for fantasy purposes?
I have a little bit more question about Lipshunov. So he's not my number 2. So I have them ranked like this: Perek number 1, and I think there's a bit of a gap until the next group.
Okay.
I have Buyam at number 2. It's crazy to me that he went 12. Like that was
Hmm.
wild, and no pun intended that he went to Minnesota. But I mean, when he fell to 11, I think everybody was thinking like, okay, San Jose is going to take him, and then they didn't, and then Minnesota traded up to get Buyam, which was the correct move there. Um, so I'll just say him, and then I'll talk a little about him. So I have Perek
Sure.
1, Buyam 2, Artem Lashunov 3, Kari Yakimchuk 4, Sam Dickinson 5, Cole Hudson 6, Adam Yurchek 7, Alphonse Frey 8, Anton Salayev all the way down at 9, Leo Celine Wallenius at 10, and I threw Henry Muse in there at 11 just for good fun. But there's a pretty
Hmm.
consensus top 6 here, which Salayev was part of,
Right.
and I don't think it's too big of a surprise to me that the order was kind of jumbled. and they went righty, righty, righty before they went lefty, lefty, lefty. So it's
Hmm.
just more people have find it harder to acquire right-handed D. So, Levshunov, Yakimchuk, and Perek were the first three off the board, and that's because I think a big part of it is the three of them are right-handed. I think we were all a bit shocked when Yakimchuk went 7
Hmm.
because the consensus was more that he was like the 5th or 6th best of that group. And the fact that he went second was a shock, I think, to a lot of us. Like,
Hmm.
really? But, Ottawa does Ottawa things.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I'm still trying to tease that out for myself. I have come to at least Perek and Buyam at the top myself. Levshunov feels like a safe pick for fantasy purposes. Like you feel pretty good that you're getting a guy who's going to be there and he's going to do something. But yeah, like if you're in the top 5 of your rookie draft for fantasy in your dynasty league this year, I don't know if you're looking for a guy who's safe necessarily. You're probably looking for somebody who's going to turn around the fortunes of your fantasy team and kind of be that cornerstone piece. So that's obviously the part that's a little bit more difficult on that front. I
Yeah.
do want. Sorry, if you got more, then by all means jump in there.
Yeah, I just want to talk a little bit more about some of these guys. I agree with
Sure.
Lifshunov. I mean, I have him at 3 because I think he has top pairing upside, but
Right.
I like when you look at how these guys created in junior and college, like I don't have questions about how Breck and Puyam can do that in the
Hmm.
NHL. With Lifshunov, I think it's he played this really wild rover style, and you look at that and you're just like, I don't know, like how all that's going to work in the NHL. Maybe I think there are also questions about Yakimchuk because a big part of his appeal was his goal scoring, and well, this as when you look at the data, like repeatability of defenseman goal scorers is just not very good.
Yeah.
So, is he really going to be a goal scorer? I don't think so. Can he generate points in other ways? Yeah, but I think that he's an offensive defenseman that's going to have to adapt quite a bit to make that work. So I think the potential and the skill is there, but there's more questions. The reason I have him ahead of Dickinson is because of that, because he has that. But Dickinson is I mean, I think the Sharks drafted their top left-handed, like their first line top left-handed D for the next decade. Like he's really
Hmm.
good all around, but I just
Yeah.
don't know he's going to be that good in fantasy. So he's going to
Right.
play a lot, and he might run the power play. Right now, they don't really have any other options, but he's still a couple years away from being an option. And so I question the offense there, but I have him ahead of Hudson because I mean, we've seen what Lane has done in college, but
Yeah.
there's still no guarantee that he's going to be that good in the NHL. So, and I think Cole, there's a chance Cole could even be better than his brother because he did better than Lane with less at the USNTDP, and
Yeah.
he is quite a bit younger. Like his birthday was literally Friday, the first round of the draft, which was really a bummer that he didn't get drafted on day 1. That would have been such a cool story.
Yeah.
Um, and then Juracek, I mean, we'll talk a little bit more about him later, but I don't know that offense is going to translate. Frey is one that I think is really interesting because I think he has like underrated potential. So like if you want to get a good offensive defenseman that has a really good chance of being a top 4 guy, Alphonse Frey is probably your guy. Like he's probably the one
Hmm.
that the fewest people are talking about. And the one that I would stay away from is Anton Salayev because even though like he's big and a lot of people like him, and I think he's a great fit in New Jersey because he could like lock down, like he's the kind of, he's like the Paul Martin to the Brent Burns, which is like,
Hmm.
did you really want that guy in fantasy? I don't think so.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I feel about him. Like he's gonna play a lot, he's gonna have good minutes, but like I think he's gonna be someone that you just look at in fantasy and be like, why don't you do more? Like you're out
Yeah.
there a lot, but it's not really worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, that is always one of the more difficult things. You see a guy with top 10 draft capital and you're like, "Oh yeah, this guy should be he's going to be out there. He's definitely going to provide fantasy value," but it's not always that simple. Sometimes, you get these guys that are super valuable to their NHL teams but are much less valuable to us in fantasy, and that's just how it goes. Um, I do want to step over to just what I'll call the surprise segment, I guess. In your top 10, who do you think is the most surprising rank that you've got there? If it's one of these defensemen, how high you've got them, or just somebody in the top 10 that you think most people wouldn't have in their top 10 for fantasy purposes, or just as a draft take in general.
I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I don't know if it's that surprising. Like I think so. My top 10, which I'll just say on here, but I have this behind a paywall, so I don't usually advertise it. But I have Celebrini, Demidov, Perek, Cadden, Agimla, Buyum, Lindstrom, Levshunov, Iserman, and Yakubchuk. I don't think that's really surprising. Anyone, maybe Iserman, just because he went 20th.
Mm-hmm.
But I still think most people for fantasy would put him close to a top 10. So it's probably not that surprising. So I don't know. I don't think it's that surprising actually, but I think those are the top 10 best. Maybe a bit surprising on who I don't have. Like I don't have Seneca in the
Right.
top 10. Some people were I know that was kind of one question. Some people were like, "Oh my God, Seneca at 3. What are they thinking?" Like there were some surprises, but I think most of us were like, yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Like he's a very unique player. He's a right shot, right wing that's really tall. He needs to fill out a little bit, but he's got a ton of skill. And he's like, there aren't that many players that are like him,
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of when you're drafting that high, you want something that you can't usually get anywhere else. And it made sense, actually. So I have him just outside the top 10. And I think that he has a lot of upside, but I just don't have him quite there. But so maybe it's more surprising who I don't have, and he's one of them. And I guess the other one that I don't have, or the couple other ones that I don't have, is Dickinson and Salayev, which a lot of people do in their top 10.
Right. All right. Um, you alluded to Seneca being a pretty big surprise. Who do you think was the biggest surprise pick of the draft? And did it change anything about the way that you looked at the player? Or does it just kind of make you raise your eyebrows and think maybe that team doesn't know what they're doing?
Well, I never like to question what teams are doing because they have lots of really smart people evaluating these guys all year.
Hmm.
But there were two things that definitely made, I think, all of us a bit like raise our eyebrows. And the first one was Carter Yakimchuk at 7. I think we were all like, "What, really?"
Hmm.
There was Dickinson, there was Perek, there was Buyum, there was, in fact, a fun little tidbit. I heard from someone that works from the Senators that Buyum was on the Ottawa Senators do not draft list. Like they were
Interesting.
seriously, they didn't had no interest in him. They thought he wasn't something about the attitude or the way he competed. And my response to that is if you don't want Z Boom on your team, then you might need to reevaluate your team priorities because that guy just wins at everything. Like, I don't know what you're thinking because he's great.
Hmm.
That definitely shifted things because that meant that, and then with Cadden going at 8, which is maybe a bit like, I don't have a problem with that, but I think a lot of us thought he's 5'10, so he's a little bit smaller. So maybe he'd slip out of the top 10. So once Yakimchuk and Cadden went, then it was like, whoa, some of these other teams are going to get Perek, Salayev, Dickinson, Buyum, like a really, really good defenseman. So that pushed like the top 6 defensemen, 4 of them down the board a bit. And that was a bit surprising. But yeah, so that was a big one. I think the second one was Jet Luchenko to Philly, which
Yeah.
was, I think we were all like, what? There
Hmm.
were so many other good forwards on the board, and a lot of them went right after that. But apparently that was their guy. That's, they wanted him, and he's definitely one of the guys in the bottom tier for me. I think the big thing with Luchenko is that I think Philly thinks that he can be a center long term. And that's always
Mm.
the question, is like, is this guy really a center? Because if he's a center, then the value goes up a lot, right? And
Right.
they apparently think so. I think I talked to a lot of scouts who really question that assumption. And anyways, but for fantasy, I would avoid Jet Luchenko because even though he bangs a lot, I think he's going to be a really solid player. I don't think he's going to bring the value that you want. And so that also, I mean, that meant Hellenius, Brenzig Nygaard, Boerver, Connolly, Hage, all these guys were available to other teams because the Philly went a bit out of order. I mean, Luchenko was consensus like in the 20s, so
Yeah.
it was definitely a bit early.
Yeah. Luchenko from my local Guelph Storm here. So it was
Yeah, that's right.
good to
Did you get
see
to see
him.
him? You get to see him live?
Yeah, I've seen him. Wasn't a great showing when I saw him, but yeah, it was decent. I'm happy to obviously anytime you get a guy from your local team that you've seen play, it's always a little bit exciting to see them go high in the draft. So that was fun, at least in that regard. I am interested. I think this is maybe potentially anyway an edge that we might be able to find as fantasy managers. I think that we can look at which teams have a good history of drafting the best, and we can kind of look at the players they're drafting and maybe, see a little bit of the style of player that they like to draft. Do they tend to consistently find, some of these smaller guys with high amounts of skill? Are they consistently drafting, going off the board, but they're actually making good picks? Are there any of these teams that over the last little while have kind of stuck out to you as just kind of consistently winning at the draft? And do you think that there is something to that for fantasy purposes where we might be able to evaluate what they're doing, or even just like kind of copy their homework and just, take the guys that they take?
Yeah, for sure. So I have my own thoughts, but I also reached out to Shane Malloy. And if you guys don't know Shane, he does Hockey Prospect Radio and Sirius XM. And this guy does his homework. And so he kind of relayed to me that a while ago, from like '06 to 11, Pittsburgh was amazing. They were clicking close to 50%. Like they were really hitting out of the park. And then all those guys were let go or fired, or somehow the amateur scouting guy was demoted, which doesn't make any sense. But so they're no longer good at that. But I think clearly the winners right now, the best and the best, are Washington, Anaheim, and Los Angeles. And they have drafted 2 to 3 times NHLers, and his metric is usually 200 NHL games played, which is a pretty good measuring stick. I mean, he's the one who
Hmm.
kind of invented that. Everyone kind of copies that now, but that was really his idea, and that was based on some data and talking to NHL GMs. Like, when do you want to offer this guy his first real contract? And it's about 200 games. So
Right.
Anaheim, LA, Los Angeles, I think are the best. I think some of the things I would say about that is Anaheim knows how to draft defenders. Like, you look at the Anaheim defenders, they pretty much all become NHLers or get traded to someone else. I mean, we've seen it, right? We've seen Shea Theodore, we've seen,
Yeah.
Montour, we've seen the guys that they currently have, Drysdale, I don't know, that one might still work out. But they just, I mean, even their depth guys, it's like all of their guys pretty much end up working out. It's like impressive. And Los
Yeah.
Angeles has drafted really, really well. I think the thing you can say about LA is they did not manage their assets well. They had too many guys
Right.
ready at the same time, and they kind of screwed that up. Washington may surprise some people just based on what their pool looks like now, but they
Hmm.
get NHLers out of it. They may not be the most exciting players,
Right.
but they get NHLers. And I think it's worth mentioning who the worst are. And by
Yeah.
far, it's Montreal, Colorado, New York Rangers, and Vancouver. And so looking at the data, Anaheim, Washington, and LA are almost 3 times better than Montreal, which is
Mm.
bananas. Like, so
Yeah.
when you look at who, I mean, I think Montreal, obviously, I mean, taking Demidov was a home run this year. So I don't think, like, you can't necessarily use that for this draft. This is just, you have to look back at least 5 years because that's how
Sure.
long it takes. So that's been the historical thing. And some of the things I was discussing with them is that some of the high profile wins, like I was thinking about Dallas, right? Because Dallas with Jason Roberts,
Right.
Levi Johnston, you know, some of these high profile ones have been good, but looking at the whole totality of their drafts haven't been quite as proficient, but they've had some
Mm.
big name wins, right? And so that's good. And so I always kind of look at Dallas, and one of the guys that Dallas took was Emil Hemming at the end of the first round. And
Yep.
I think that's a home run. I think he's really, I mean, he can hammer the puck, man, that guy. And I think he's got an underrating playmaking side. So Dallas is another team I look at, and Minnesota, when they hired Judd Brackett, I think have had really good drafts. We don't have enough years now to really say that they
Hmm.
have been really good at it, but I think that they have, minus their, I was trying to remember who their first rounder was last year or 2 years ago. So they maybe have not hit on all of them, but you're never going to hit on all of them. So
Hmm.
you have to just be okay with that. Hold on one sec as I pull up who I was thinking of before I forget,
Yeah.
because that was a bit of a miss. Who am I thinking of? 2021 was it?
A little
This
bit
is great.
earlier.
This is great. This is great.
That's all right. Um,
Uh, Go ahead.
one,
I'll think of it.
yeah, no problem. Yeah, I think it raises an interesting question for me too. Like just thinking about the difference between the first group of teams you mentioned, and then something like a Dallas where it does seem like they found these star players even a little bit later. Um, yeah, I kind of wonder like if we should think about it from a fantasy perspective, should we be thinking about, only the star players? Because really, if you get those big hits, that kind of really outweighs all the minor hits, right? Especially for fantasy, we're
Mhm.
only really looking for the top end guys. To some extent, I think probably the NHL teams would rather, they'd take a little bit lower of a hit percentage if they could hit on some actual kind of game changers, because you kind of feel like you can fill out a team in free agency or whatever. Anyway, it just kind of raises an interesting question for me. I wonder, I'm sure it's a topic of conversation among NHL front offices when they're going to the draft. Like, what kind of brand of player are we looking for? Probably even more so when you get into that like 20 to 30 range of the first round, right? And it's all the premier guys are probably off the board at that point. So you're left doing some projecting and thinking about what this guy could be if everything works out correctly. If we develop this guy correctly, what can he be? Yeah, I don't know if you got any thoughts on that, but I think that's at least an interesting line of thinking.
Yeah, definitely. Charlie Stramel was the Minnesota Wild pick that I was thinking of. I think
Ah,
they blew it on that one, but overall, I definitely agree. I mean, I think that they're a lot of the teams are just thinking like, get me NHLers. It's funny because recently, when Barry Trotz took over as GM, he's like, I'm going to swing for the fences, and that's what he's told his amateur scouts is just find, swing for the fences, find value, and that's what I think that they've done. I mean, some people say they reached with Igor Surin at 22. I think that's a fantastic pick. I think that guy is going to be
mhm.
really good. Teddy Stiga at 55 was fantastic. Miguel Marquez at 87. I mean, I think that they have been hitting out of the park with their current approach. Of course, we do not know about any of this yet because we have to
Yeah.
wait and see. But I do think that that's been a bit of a shift for them. I think Carolina is another team that it seems like public scouts every year love their draft, and so they often take they usually take the Russian that no one wants to take, or
Hmm.
the guy who's maybe a bit undersized with super skills. So they tend to buck the trend. But the interesting thing about that, which I think Corey Pronman made this point, is that the rest of the league doesn't really share their value on their prospects. So even though we may look at their pool
Mm.
and be like, oh, it's so cool and their guys have good upside, when if they try to trade those guys, sometimes it's like, nah, we don't really,
Yeah.
which we kind of saw was interesting with the Gensel trade, right? It was like
Yep.
luckily they had a bunch of guys that they could throw at them, and Pittsburgh needed needed help in the pipeline, so they were just like, yeah, take these three, whatever. But there were clearly guys that they were not willing to part with that were part of
Hmm.
their pool, which is kind of the nice thing about having such a stacked pool. So I think you do see some teams that kind of have a type or swing for the fences. I think St. Louis and Philly also clearly have a type, which are they want tough, hard to play
Yep.
against guys. They don't
Yep.
necessarily care about the super high skilled. I think Toronto has done some really good job. They find value. Some people were mocking that Easton Cowan pick last year, and now they're like, oh,
Yeah.
those people are not talking anymore. Vegas also has a type, which is I don't care what anybody thinks about anything. We're just gonna take the guy. So, I
Yeah.
mean, I think we all kind of knew they were going to take Trevor Connolly, who, if
Mm.
you're not following the draft, has had some character questions and issues come up, and of course Vegas takes him because like they don't care about that.
Yeah. One other team that I thought was kind of interesting, and specifically because I'm interested in the player they took, but Buffalo has had a nice little run. If you go back over their last few drafts, they have the Cousins draft, they have the Paterka and Quinn draft, they have the Power draft, the Kulich draft where they had those three first rounders. Savoy and Oslin were the other two there. They get Zach Benson last year, who I know is a player that you really liked.
Mm-hmm.
And then this year, I'm pretty interested in Consta Helenius. Interested in your thoughts on the player. He shows up pretty well in, kind of the modeling side of things. Like if you look at Byron Bader's hockey prospecting model, he has a comp in there with William Nylander, which would obviously be a pretty high end outcome. But yeah, just give me your thoughts on Helenius. He went at 14 to the Sabres. I think the Sabres have done a pretty decent job of hitting even in the kind of middle area of the first round. So I'm curious your thoughts there.
Yeah, I think that it was a really interesting pick because the last thing they needed was an undersized, skilled forward, quite frankly.
Hmm.
But that's what
Yeah.
they took because he's he's 5'11". He's not like super small or anything. He's 190 pounds, so he's pretty thick, and he's played professionally, so I think that's very appealing.
Right.
But I think the thing about Hellenius is that, and we saw this, like when he played in Liga, it was super impressive. It's like, wow, he's doing such a good job. And then he played at the U18s where he was supposed to be the man, right? Like
Yeah.
he's gonna do everything for this team. And like he was good, but he wasn't dominant. You would think someone who's playing in Liga against this really tough competition would just, go down several levels and just like look like he's playing pawn hockey. And he definitely
Hmm.
did not. And he didn't necessarily raise the level of play of all his teammates around him. So I think that made a lot of us conclude that he's just a really excellent complementary player, which is,
Yeah.
no slander on that. I mean, he actually reminds me a lot of Arturi Lehkonen, who's just
Okay.
an awesome complementary player. But is he really someone that moves the needle a lot in fantasy? I mean, it wasn't really until he went to Colorado, and then it's only when he's on the power play, right? Like
Right.
other than that, he's kind of like, you're not like super excited to have him on your team. And I think that's what Hellenius is. Like real life, I think like he could play in the NHL the next season. Like he's that
Hmm.
competent, but I think he's competent in a way that he doesn't necessarily dictate the play. He doesn't necessarily drive the
Hmm.
bus, but he's really good at playing with just about anybody, however they want to play. He can adapt to it. He can mold to it. He can play off anybody, no matter their skill level or pace, which is a super valuable thing. I mean, he's a Swiss Army knife. Like he can play with anyone in any situation. But for fantasy, I'm quite a bit lower on him because I just think he's going to end up being like borderline replacement level, which is not great.
Yeah. Well, that kind of leads me into my next question, which is which players do you think could play right away? Um, yeah, obviously, I think everybody believes that Macklin Celebrini could step in and be an impact player in the NHL right away. But beyond him, are there many players in this draft class that you see as guys that could instantly step in and be something? Is there anybody else that we're really thinking about for redraft purposes, or is it more like if they play, like they'll get some time. They might look impressive, but their fantasy relevant years might be some years away yet.
Yeah, I think it's the latter. In redraft, I think it's Celebrini.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't think you're looking at anyone too hard. If they play, they might be okay. I think Levshunov, we kind of touched on that earlier. I think he could. I think it's probably
Hmm.
better for him to go back to college for another year. Bouillon, I think he could. I mean, the guy won everything he could last year.
Right.
I'm not sure how much more he has to prove, but I think it'll depend on what they want because he's NCAA. He can't play in the NHL, AHL. So I think
Hmm.
it'll be interesting to see what he does. They got a good situation there in Colorado in Denver. So I mean, he could just go back and try for another one. Hellenius, we just talked about. I think he could. I think Hellenius could play in the NHL, but I don't think it'll be exciting for fantasy. Like I think he'll be a
Right.
middle six forward and just. The other one is Michael Brenzig Nygaard, who's kind of the Norwegian version of Hellenius. I think not quite as good, but similar. It's also hilarious because you talk about types. Detroit has a type.
Yeah.
I think it was Cam who said like they basically drafted the same player 3 years in a row: Marco Casper, Michael Brenzig Nygaard, and Nate Danielson, who are all from
Right.
different countries, but they play the same style, like two-way, responsible, like some skill, but nothing too flashy. So they're the same person basically.
Yeah.
And then the last one, who I think maybe is a bit surprising to some, but I think Stein Solberg
Mm.
could play in the NHL, which would be a big jump because he was playing in the Norwegian top league, which is like not um, a very well-known league, but the
Yeah.
guy is massive and he skates super well. At the World Championship, he was shutting down the top offensive forwards from other teams, and it was like people were being surprised by him. And of course, who drafted him? The Anaheim Ducks. That's right, because they know how
Yeah.
to draft defensemen. 6'2", 205, and I mean the kid just chooses violence every time he can. He's
Hmm.
going to be a menace to play against. So in bangers leagues, I mean, this is like they were talking about and comparing him to Radko Gudas, who's a Duck right now, and I think
Hmm.
he's a more agile, more tactical, and slightly more offensive version of Radko Gudas. So if you like that type of player, then Stein Solberg is your man. And I don't think he will play this year, but he's pretty close. And I think, he's going to be in the SHL. It's possible he comes over even at the end of the season because they have an early season in the SHL.
Mhm.
But I think that he's someone who's not too far away. I think he's one of the biggest risers from this draft for sure.
Yeah, I've definitely seen some of the Twitter highlight reels of Solberg just running around ending guys' rushes with violence.
Yeah.
It's pretty entertaining stuff. If you just search his name, you'll find it for sure.
The nicest guy too. I mean, I
Yeah.
was there interviewing him and like just the nicest guy. I think someone asked him like, why are you so physical on the ice? And he's like, oh, I'm such a nice guy off the ice and blah blah blah. And they're like, but why are you like that? He's like, well, it works, doesn't it? And everyone
Yeah.
just like looked at him like, okay, yeah, good point.
Yeah, that's funny. There are definitely some players like that, where yeah, everybody just despises them on the ice, but you hear like lots of stories about how they're like terrific in their home communities, like
Yeah,
doing a bunch of charity work. It's kind
not
of funny
dirty.
how,
He's not a
yeah,
trouba. He's not like that.
right,
He's just very physical.
yeah. All right. Next up, I wanted to ask if you thought there were any picks, like have a pick that's your favorite for just being the best fit, where you're like, oh yeah, this guy just fits in exactly with what this team wants to do. Yeah, it's just a home run pick. He's gonna fit like a glove there. He should play pretty soon. Whatever it is, whatever makes you think that this was just a match made in heaven.
Well, I think there are a couple. I think Cole Hudson, who I mentioned already, Washington picked him, and I just think the path for him to run a top power play in Washington is wide open. By the
Hmm.
time he's ready, Carlson will be gone. I don't know that Rasmus Sandin will still be around. Even if he is, I think Hudson's better. I don't know the state of the Washington Capitals will be in when
Yeah,
Cole Hudson is ready. That's the biggest question. But like I said earlier, they have a track record of drafting really well. So, and they do have some pretty interesting prospects in their system. So, if they
yep.
all mature correctly at the right time, then Cole Hudson is going to feast. So I really like that one. Adam Yurchek, as I mentioned earlier, that's a Blues type player, and
Hmm.
he's quite a bit. He's also birthday on the draft, so it was also interesting with him going then. And I think he's actually the first player from this draft class to sign his ELC, which I also think is interesting. He went 16 to St. Louis. Yeah, Macklin hasn't signed yet, which is interesting. That's because he hasn't decided if he's going back to college, which I don't think he will. But he's Yurchek's just a Blues type player, and I think people
Hmm.
are naturally going to compare him to his brother, which I think is fair. But he's like for his draft class, he's like 9 months younger than his brother, so he has a
Hmm.
lot more runway to develop. So I think that's a good thing. And I think Luchenko, I mean, whether or not he's a center, I think he's going to be a Broad Street bully. Like that's exactly like they
Yeah,
drafted exactly the right player for that team.
yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, that note about just being younger relative to the field and relative to where you're drafted, does that like actually enter into your process at all? Like just setting aside the scouting, but like just thinking about it as a fantasy manager, like maybe it's a more of a tiebreaker kind of thing. Like if you're looking at two guys, you're like, ah, these guys are pretty much the same to me, but this guy was, yeah, like born almost a year later, and so he's definitely, you could foresee that he has more developing to do. Does that really enter into your mind at all when you're making fantasy decisions?
Yeah, it does. I think it has to some extent. I mean, you don't want to go crazy with it, but
Right.
I think that, when you're talking about like Juracek is a good example. He played this entire, well, he was injured, but he played
Mm.
as a 17-year-old in the top Czech league. You're
Yeah.
talking about some of these guys who are August and July birth dates, and they're playing their entire draft season as a 17-year-old. It's like, where do they go from here? Like they have a lot
Yeah.
more room to develop. Whereas some of the guys that are like October, November birth dates, I think Fantilli was a classic example of that. You look at Fantilli versus Bedard last year. I mean, I know that it's not necessarily a fair comparison, but Bedard was a summer birthday and Fantilli was a fall birthday. And it's like, how much more does Fantilli have to develop because he's already so much older? And those guys that were older and more mature for their draft class, it has always been that way from the time they
Yeah.
were playing Pee Wee midget. Like the whole time they've been bigger, stronger. And I think that it really helps the younger guys. Like, well, it helps the older guys early because they're just physically dominant. They push guys around, but that doesn't really teach you the right skills, right? Because
Yep.
when you're have to fight for it and you're smaller, you really have to learn how to like get good potty position and how to, avoid the checks and how to, play a more pro type style. So I think it actually does help the younger guys. And it's interesting because if you just look at numbers, clearly the most NHLers come from the middle, which is like the January, February, March kind of area,
Yeah.
because there's just more of them born at that time. So it's kind of a numbers game. But if you look at the younger guys, you don't know exactly what they're going to be. You know even less what they're going to be as compared to the older guys. And so
Hmm.
you kind of think about some of the older guys and you think like how much more do they have to develop because of where they are. And so that definitely enters into my mind. If they're even, and I'll pretty much, or even close, I'll pretty much always pick the younger guy, because I just think there's a lot more room to develop here, and I'm willing to make that bet on the runway that they have.
Yeah. All right. I love that. Let's talk about goalies. Have to do it, unfortunately. But let's talk about them. Definitely no like top tier, definitely no first
No
round
Wallstead.
goalie. Yeah, no Wallstedt. Good way to put it. But there are some goalies that had some hype. I think maybe more of projection hype than necessarily production hype in some cases. But are there any of these goalies that you're targeting, guys that you might, throw a third or a fourth round pick at in some of your rookie drafts this year? Is there anybody that you actually think maybe went to a spot where you think they'll develop them correctly? Whatever is getting you interested. Are there any of those guys that move the needle for you?
Yeah, there's a few guys. I mean, in general, I would say always look at the Euro goalies. And if you want some dissertation or information on that, go look at Byron Bader's stuff, because he's
Mhm.
done the analysis. And the pro goalies, especially the overagers, they just develop better. Right? There's something about seeing professional shots from a younger age, and developing in those leagues that are much more difficult. The learning curve is higher, it's steeper, and when they come over, they translate much better. And it's just a fact that the North American goalies, just especially Canada, sorry, but they have not been good for a very long
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Um, there's also a development thing with the American goalies, which is interesting. So I heard Kevin Woodley talk about this, and it's the American goalies. The way that they coach is to accentuate their skills and figure out what they're good at and help them be better at that. Apparently, the way that Canada is doing it is like play this style, which
Right.
doesn't always work for everybody. So I think that's part of it. Like the Canadian goalies have not been great, but I would definitely take a Euro goalie over any American goalie. And so there's some really interesting ones. Like Nabokov was the first goalie taken, and he is not related
Hmm.
to Evgeny Nabokov, but Ilya Nabokov. He's
Hmm.
he's 6'1", undersized, and he's 21. He's a double overager. So man, that guy is ready. Like
Yeah.
he can walk over now, which I think is something you want in drafting a goalie. Like
Sure.
so he led Metalurg Magnitogorsk to the KHL championship last year, and he
Hmm.
was like the reason they won. He was amazing. So goalies sometimes struggle when they come over to North American ice. So I'd be a little hesitant on that. And they don't have the best pipeline, but he's an option. Mikhail Yegorov is another one. New Jersey took him. They've struggled with some goalie stuff lately, but he's massive, 6'5", and has a lot of upside. So I think he's another one. Carter George, who won the U18s, was the third goalie taken. He's another one that's interesting, but again, I probably would not take the Canadian goalie, just
Hmm.
personally. Emil Vinny was the fourth goalie taken to Edmonton, and I liked him, but when Edmonton took him, I was like, oh no, like they actually have a really bad track record of developing goalies. So I mean, I think Stuart Skinner excelled in spite of their system, not because of it. So
Mm.
that's someone that I worry about. Another one that I'm interested in is Kim Saarinen, who went to Seattle, and I think for the most part, we don't have a lot of data yet, but Seattle has kind of known what they're doing so far. The
Mhm.
last one I'll throw out is Christian Kirch, who the Sharks took, and I got some good information from Sheng Peng. Apparently, he was the number one goalie on their list, which is always
Wow.
like surprising because he was like the seventh goalie or something like that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 12th goalie taken.
Wow.
Um,
Yeah.
so, and he's Swiss, and he's also really young. He's a June birth date, but he's six
Mm.
four, and he played in the junior Swiss league. So, we don't know a whole lot about that, but it's always kind of interesting to me when the team tells you, yeah, they were the 12th guy taken, but they were the top on our list. It's like, I mean, that doesn't mean they're right, but it's
Yeah.
interesting that he was that high on their list. So,
Yeah.
I probably won't draft any of these guys, but it's just interesting. I mean, if I have a late round flyer for sure, I'll like a third, fourth round pick. If I have space on my roster, I'll probably go for the Russians and then maybe
Mhm.
some of the other guys. But yeah, that's I definitely ascribe to the 0G strategy. I never try to go for the top guys, but I will try to get value in the later guys.
Yeah. Uh, I wonder if there's anything like it obviously depends on the league first and foremost, but yeah, we're talking about zero G in Dynasty and how that you can apply that over there. I wonder if there is something to just yeah, trying to grab a bunch of these later round guys if you see like a path where um yeah, there is at least a path, a kind of lineage plan that you can see where, you know, it might not happen right now, but in the next 3 to 4 years, you could see it happening. um, just get a few of those guys and stash them on your roster. Yeah, it might be worth those some of those fourth round picks just to take those flyers, especially on the guys with the high upside projections and guys in situations. You know, some of these teams we've seen them develop goaltenders and do pretty well at it, like you've mentioned. Yeah, I wonder if there's something to that. Do you think there's any truth to that statement, or would you rather try to figure it out? You know, maybe trade for a guy that you see rising in a system. How do you think? What's the best way to go about it in your dynasty leagues?
I think there's two ways. One is, you know, if a guy like Wallstedt, Askarov, you know, those types that have played professionally in Europe at an early age and had success, those are guys I would waste a mid first round pick on. Like I think those
Mm.
guys are worth it. Aside from that, I would only take them in the later rounds if I had space on my team, because I
Mhm.
think the better option, the third option, is to wait till after the draft and see these late risers, because there's always guys that aren't drafted that start excelling, you know, in Europe, and then some team signs them and then they come over and it's like then
Yeah,
that's the guy you want, because you don't
right.
have to wait. They've already kind of shown themselves later on and they're going to be ready much sooner. So unless you can draft those studs early on, which are typically all Euros. None of the North American guys have really been that in a very long time. You know,
Yeah.
I think maybe Carey Price was the last one, and that was a long time ago.
Hmm.
So then just go for the overage Euros that depends on your league. Like some of my leagues, once they've passed through the draft, you can add them at any time. And
Yep.
so that's what we always do is like just pay attention to those Euro leagues, whoever's catching fire, and just like add them. And you can always add them, hold them for like 6 months to a year, see how they're doing, see if they get signed, and then or if they get signed, add them, and then wait, see what they do, and if they come over and they have success, like there's a lot of guys who have done that, and they're
Yeah.
currently doing well in the NHL, and so there's no reason to waste a pick on that.
Fair enough. All right, we're getting close to the end here, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you if you had a favorite sleeper to give us, or two if you got more than one. But yeah, who's your favorite sleeper? And I promise I won't snipe you in our draft this later this summer.
Yeah. Well, when I was doing the draft coverage with Peter Harling, we did a little video and I misspoke his name, which was actually kind of funny. So Teddy Stiga is the guy, and I called him
Mhm.
Steady Tiga, which is pretty appropriate because he's steady. He's just like, he's so consistent. He's all around guy, but he has some scoring upside. So I don't think he's
Mhm.
just going to be like a boring middle six guy. Like he might be that, but he also could be a bit more of a scorer. And he went to Nashville, which is also one of those teams that I'm think is doing the right thing. He
Mhm.
he went 55th overall because he's 5'10". But when you watch him play, you're like, this guy's a 5'10". He's out there just hammering guys, like getting body position, stealing the puck, like, but he has really soft, good hands too. So I like Stiga. I like John Mustard at 67. He's another
Mhm.
guy. He went to Chicago. He's a goal scorer, so I like him. Henry Muse is the guy who's kind of fallen off in terms of how much people like him, but I think he still has pretty significant upside. It's interesting that he went to Calgary, who just drafted Zane Parekh, and I think Henry Muse is like a worse version of Zane Parekh, so I think that kind of hurts him. But you never get married to the team that drafts him, because they can always get
Right.
traded. So Henry Muse, I think, is interesting. And the last one is Aaron Kiviharu,
Mm.
who, if you would have told anybody 2-3 years ago that Minnesota Wild drafted Aaron Kiviharu, they would have said, "Oh, they won the lottery."
Yeah.
No, because he was talked about as a top five, maybe even first overall pick, but he had some various issues, some of them injury related, some of them lack of production. And also he was 5'9" then, and now he's still only 5'10". So that's part of it as well. But he's a super dynamic offensive defenseman. And my favorite thing is that right after he got picked in the fourth round, he shook Bill Guerin's hand and he just said, "You got the steal of the draft. I'm going to show it
Yeah.
to you." And I
I
love
saw
that.
that.
You love
Yeah.
that confidence, right? Like he's like, and now it's up to him to back it up. But I love that confidence in him, and I do think he could put it together. Like I'm not gonna bet my house on it or anything, but I do think that if anyone in that fourth round can become a top four defenseman, it's Aaron Kibiharu.
Yeah, yeah, I saw that clip circulating on Twitter, and yeah, you just have to love that kind of stuff. And it says something too, right? Like if the guy's got that much confidence, it means he wants to back it up. It means he has that pride in himself and his
Mm-hmm.
performance. So I think it definitely does mean something. Um, I think that's all the questions I had. Victor, is there anything else, any players that you really like that we didn't get to organically with the questions here? I think that's all that I had on my side.
Yeah, those are the main ones. I think there's some other guys that we could mention. One of them, I'll just mention a couple. So I had in my
Sure.
tier four some guys that I think are really interesting, but have a lot of volatility to them. And Tarek
Mm,
Parasak is probably the top. I had I talked to everyone I could about Tarek Parasak, and pretty much everybody gave me a different opinion. So I'm still
mhm.
very confused about what to think about him. But some of the people I trust the most said that they would bet money that he's going to be a top six NHLer. So take that for what you want. I will probably not be drafting him. So Nate, go ahead if you want
All
to.
right.
Sasha Boerver is another one who
Mm,
has a lot of skill, but is has some foot speed issues. Igor Surin, I mentioned, I love that guy, so I would be leaning at him at the end of the first. Dean Letourneau is a very interesting prospect. He is enormous, 6'7". He's going. Boston drafted him. He's going to play college in Boston. He was drafted out of high school, so it's like you watch him play, and it's just like he's toying with
yeah.
three points per game, like
Yeah.
video game nonsense. But I think he has a lot of tools that could make him interesting. I mentioned Alphonse Frey. Andrew Basha is another one who I think has a lot of speed and skill. Ryder Ritchie is another second or third round pick that's interesting. And I mentioned Leo Saline Wallenius.
Mhm.
So those are some guys that I think you should pay attention to. Like if you're like second round, those are guys that I would take flyers on.
Definitely. I'll have to familiarize myself a little bit more there as well. All right, Victor. Well, you've been very gracious with your time. I do appreciate it. Yeah, I'll try to not take your advice too closely when we get into our draft together later this off season. But yeah, definitely appreciate your insight and that fantasy bent to the hockey prospecting space that you bring. But that's going to be all that we've got for this episode. Hopefully, it brought you some value, helped you get a little bit better at fantasy hockey today. And many thanks to the band They're There for supplying the music for the podcast. Be sure to check out their Spotify as well. Victor, what's the latest thing that you got that people can click on? I feel like you got new stuff coming out all the time. Where should we send people? I'll put some stuff in the show description for sure.
Yeah, lots of stuff. Thank you. So Fantasy Hockey Live, Jesse and I are doing our team by team previews. We're into the 2 a week schedule time.
Mm-hmm.
So check those Sunday, Wednesday feeds. So we're doing lots of great content with Kat Silverman breaking down prospect goalies, and we have our scouts talking prospects. And we cover the whole team with beat writers. So that's good stuff. And then with Peter Harling, we were at the draft together covering all the draft stuff. So we're going to be doing some more draft content and talking to some scouts and experts and doing some organizational ranks and things like that with them. I also write at EP Rinkside, and I've taken a break the last month or so because there's been a lot going on. So, but I'll probably do some breakdowns of, guys that were better in fantasy, and you can get them at value. So those kinds of things. But check out my work there at EP Rinkside.
Awesome. All right. Well, that's going to be it, folks. Much love.